After the Democratic Convention, I thought if only Moses could have heard a refrain similar to the chant heard on Monday night when the entire auditorium erupted with, "Thank you, Joe." If only the Israelites had gathered and cheered as they had once done at the shores of the Red Sea, at the foot of Sinai, and even in their rebellion when they crafted the golden calf. If only they had called out repeatedly in unison, "Thank you, Mo! Thank you, Mo!" That loving expression of gratitude offered to a man who was the lifelong leader of the people, all the people, would have gone a long way to heal the hurt that Moses must have felt as he approached the twilight of his career. Like Joe, Mo was a man of devotion who gave it his best. He understood that he was not going to lead the people, his people, through the next chapter, and for him, the promised land would remain just that, a promise. In our portion, Akev, Moses is still internalizing that realization. He won't be leading the community much longer, but he can still teach, and he does, by reminding them of all the seminal events which have shaped their character and identity. Lifting up every turn of their history together, Moses reminds them of the lessons that emerged from their work together: to obey and observe and worship. Remember, he admonished, that we had to take the long way, not the easy way. That it was God who freed you from bondage, he said. God who brought water from the rock. God who fed you with manna. Friends, he said, remember too how you sinned with the golden calf and how I just lost it, smashing the tablets right before your eyes. Remember that too, because I am not perfect, no one is. Remember, Moses warned, because once you've arrived, once you are comfortable, once you are satisfied, it's easy to think that you did it all on your own and that there's no more work to do. Now, Moses doesn't know what the promised land has in store. He's never been there, and now he knows he never will. But what he does know is the future holds a good land. As we heard through Rabbi Sapaden's beautiful chanting, a land with streams and springs and fountains, hills and plains, wheat and barley, vines, figs and pomegranates, olives and honey, where the promise is that the people will lack nothing. Moses has an interesting point about what can happen when we take things for granted. The text spells it out. When you've eaten your fill and have built fine houses to live in, and your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold have increased, and everything you own has prospered, beware, lest your heart grow haughty, and you forget the Lord your God, and then you say to yourselves, my own power and my own hand have won this wealth for me. In the twilight of his life, Moses is still teaching us that we shouldn't feel so deserving and be so self-congratulatory. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory noted, what Moses was saying to the new generation was this: you thought 40 years of wandering in the wilderness was the real challenge. and that once you conquer and settle the land, your problems will be over. But the truth is that is where the real challenge will begin. The real challenge is not poverty, but affluence, not insecurity, but security, not slavery, but freedom. And wasn't that the lesson that we heard all week from those at the convention? Freedom. And we have the freedom to shape our society. It only becomes a problem when we get complacent and take it for granted. Each political convention tells the story of our country and the values we cherish, of how democracy creates an anchor not only for Americans, but how it contributes to stability for nations worldwide. For 248 years, our nation has protected the most vulnerable, bestowing upon us rights and responsibilities as citizens, urging us to celebrate and cherish our choices by exercising our vote, which is, in fact, our voice. As is true of every convention, a vision of what our nation could be came together this week, painted by the voices of each speaker who added color to the picture, to a beautiful canvas. I was especially moved when I heard Reverend Raphael Warnock interviewed later in the week, and he explained that he saw democracy as the political embodiment of the ideal that we are all created in the divine image. And this week, when we heard so many speakers affirm that every person, regardless of the labels they wear, contributes to the strength of this land, I felt Senator Warnock's words ring true for me. In that moment, democracy became a theological statement of inclusion and diversity, affirming that you count. You, we, are trustworthy partners, that your participation, our participation, in our American covenant includes investing our strength in it so that our children may enjoy its blessings in the future. Because we are all partners in this sacred American experience. And while we also heard so much about hope this week, we know that being part of a covenantal community also charges us and carries responsibility. Here, the responsibility to act because we can't be complacent, especially when the ability to act is tied to the ability to vote. This came to me on Monday night as I listened to Hillary's speech. I was filled with renewed appreciation for the sacrifices of the suffragettes, whose work culminated 104 years ago in the right for women to vote. I understood something which was entirely opaque to me when I was 18. My youthful experience told me then, of course, women vote, because I had never considered otherwise. Voting was a right which was already enshrined in law. And my naive assumption was that the rights I enjoyed growing up were a given, that they were stable and unchanging. Later in the Torah, as Moses' oratory comes to a close, he urges the Israelites not to ignore the wisdom of the earlier generations. The very, very end of Deuteronomy, one of the last portions we read, Ha'azinu says, "Ask your elders, and they will tell you. And sometimes I wonder if I had thought to ask my grandmother about her first experience in casting a ballot, I might have recognized earlier just how precious it is. I will always be grateful to the women who preceded me, who made it possible for me and for all women of every generation to exercise our choice in voting. This is the vision of democracy where every individual counts. The convention brought attention to other choices too, and here I mean reproductive freedom and rights, which was something else I have to admit I just took for granted, since during my lifetime, these rights had never been in jeopardy. In the 60s and 70s, when the women's movement fought for reproductive freedom and control over their choices, their slogan then was, "We won't go back." Back to the fearful and dangerous days of back alley abortions. Back to a time when women even performed them on themselves, performed them on their own for other dear ones, because they had no choice and they had no access to medical care. Once Roe became law, reproductive choice became a right, or so we thought. It lasted only half a century. And let us recall as well that during the recent nomination hearings to the Supreme Court, the phrase stare decisis, a settled law, came into our lay vocabulary as each new justice was vetted. Its heavy repetition was hypnotic, lulling us into a false sense of security that was smashed when the justices chose not to uphold it. As state after state has rolled back access to reproductive health care, we see that even a settled law cannot be taken for granted. Moses was right. We cannot be complacent. You will know that for the last 2 years, in a growing number of states, women's lives have been threatened, along with suffering the indignity of not being able to make their own health care decisions, being denied critical health care when pregnancies had complications or failed. Physicians and hospitals are being forced even now to abandon their patients or risk prosecution for fulfilling their responsibility to their patients. If our vision of democracy is predicated on faith in each citizen, where is the trust our nation should place in each of us? Why are women now in a position where we need to prove that we are, in fact, trustworthy and capable? No stranger should determine the most intimate, personal, private decisions about my life or yours. For democracy to flourish, for our dignity to be honored and restored, we cannot go back, and we cannot be complacent. What this country becomes, we heard again and again this week, is up to us. Our Parsha asks the perfect thought question of a community that is about to transition into a nation. And now, O Israel, What does the Lord your God demand of you? And in our secular tradition, we have to ask the same question of ourselves as our country anticipates a transition of its own. How will we answer that? Are we willing to work for it, to ensure that our freedoms endure, so our democracy lives up to the expansive and inclusive nature of the covenant that we inherited to create a more perfect union for us all? We get to choose. Shabbat Shalom.